Good morning or almost good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country or in the world. My name is Dan Lacovara. I'm a clinical associate at the Center for Healthy Sex here in Los Angeles. So I'd like to welcome everybody to this online Skype lecture. My hope is that at the end of this lecture, you'll have a better understanding of sex addiction itself, the way it affects gay men, and how some chemicals, party drugs as they are called, can interact with and affect the kind of what we call acting out behavior that sex addicts experience. I want to make it very clear that this lecture is not meant to discuss or talk about the issue of whether sex addiction exists or not. That certainly is a conversation that continues to happen in the clinical community. But my goal is for you to have some sense of the addiction as we see it, and hopefully be able to, if you are working with clients, identify and treat appropriately. So I'm going to begin right now, and we're just going to see how it goes. Again, if you have questions, please type them to me or save them if you're on a phone call, and we'll answer them as we go. Okay? So I think the most important thing to talk about at first, because the term addiction is one that's a fairly strong one, is what sex addiction is not. Importantly, sex addiction is not a moral, ethical problem. This is not about what is right or wrong from either of these perspectives. There are many ways that people look at sexuality and sex, and it's important that we all understand that we have individual moral compasses and our own ethical approach to many things in life, including sex. Another thing sex addiction is not is a religious issue. Again, there are religions across the world that have their own opinions of and feelings about sex and sexuality. So while these things are valid, these issues are valid, we want to keep them separate from what it means to have sex and what it means to be a sex addict. Another thing that sex addiction is not, it's not a sign of a broken relationship. The concept that someone acts out in an addictive fashion does not necessarily correlate with a relationship being problematic. I think it's very important that we not connect the two of those things, or it can be very confusing about what acting out or addictive behavior is. And I think we move to the next bullet fairly easily from there, because this is not about a reason, an excuse to behave badly. It's not about, well, X is bad, so Y, then I will do Y, which is the acting out behavior. And we look at many different behaviors, both for heterosexual and homosexuals. They can include anonymous sex, cruising, etc. I noticed that I left out sociopathy. That's one I shouldn't skip, because sex addiction is not about a complete lack of empathy for or compassion for another individual. It's not about only using an individual for their own sexual needs. And I think it's also important that we talk about the pathology, some people how they pathologize sex and sexual identities, which is the last bullet. So we cannot look at sex addiction as a way to say that other identities, whether it's gay or straight, fetishes, polyamory, which is multiple partners in a loving relationship. We don't want to look at the word addiction along with the way people choose to live their lives in a sexual way, in a consensual way, and in a way that is not harmful to any individual. So I think hopefully this gives you a sense of the direction we don't want to go in terms of just the presentation and in terms of treatment. So if there are any questions at this point, feel free to email me. I've not seen one yet, so I am going to continue. So what is sex addiction? The way we define it, or it has been defined, is the repeated, compulsive seeking of a sexual experience despite negative social, psychological, and or physical consequences. I think this is a really important distinction for many people who still struggle with the notion of what addiction is in general and how sex can be an addiction. This is about when your behavior, your sexual behavior, can become so destructive for yourself and for others, that it has these major consequences. We can talk about loss of jobs, loss of relationships, loss of one's own sense of self, so psychological, injury through sex, addiction because of sex. I'm talking about drug addiction or other addictions. So this is how we conceptualize it, just as you would look at something like another addiction like alcoholism or a drug addiction. It's the repetition and the desperate need for this sexual experience despite knowing it has harmed your life. So I think it's critical that if you are struggling with how to conceptualize this or understand if it is an issue, when you talk to a client or when you're working with someone, how is their sexual behavior actually impacting their life? Again, looking at not necessarily that people who have varied sexual experiences or enjoy types of sex that may not be, quote-unquote, attractive to other people. That's not the issue here. That's, again, pathologizing and bringing in one's own judgment to it. But what happens when someone is behaving in a certain sexual manner, and what is the impact or the result? So let's talk a little bit about what sexual compulsives do. And you see that we use the word sexual compulsive here versus sex addiction. There are some people who see this as very different. They see compulsivity as more of an OCD kind of behavior, that it is a repetitive behavior, but it doesn't necessarily have the kind of profound negative consequences that other behaviors, sexual behaviors might result in. So one could argue that, if it's an addiction, it's worse than compulsivity. We may use these words interchangeably. So what are some examples of sexual addiction or compulsivity? Anonymous sex. So this is any way, shape, or form where you are having sex with a partner whom you do not know. And this can happen in bars, this can happen in public places, this can happen in all manners of environments, and you don't know this person's name, or if you know this person's name, you sort of don't know anything else about them. For gay men, and we're going to really be focusing on that now. Certainly in the past, historically, it has been places like bathhouses, adult bookstores, parks, alleyways, wherever those places where someone could have the anonymous sexual experience. And historically, for those of you who have a knowledge of the gay community, there were very few places to have gay sex. If it was not in one's home and you were looking for sex, there were not these sort of public places where you could necessarily meet someone and build a sexual experience that was based on healthy interaction. Another of the major issues for sex addicts or sexual compulsives is this excessive porn viewing and masturbation. As the world has evolved and technology has evolved, the ability to access pornography, the scope of porn that is available has really sort of kicked off a firestorm around people who have sexual addiction issues. It's just the easiest way to have a sexual experience. Now, when you talk about excessive porn viewing, one can look at that again in terms of how it impacts the individual's life. Again, there's nothing wrong with porn viewing, but what happens when an individual is watching it to a point where they're not sleeping, not going to work, not answering phone calls? What usually goes along with the porn viewing is compulsive masturbation. Again, masturbation is in of itself a healthy behavior, but we have seen clients who view porn up to 2 to 3 to 4 hours a day, masturbate for most of that time. There's something called edging, which is you continue to masturbate, and when you become close to orgasm, which is the release experience for the addict, you back off and again begin the process. Or there are people who masturbate multiple times and often to the point of injury. So we're looking at this from the perspective of how an addict gets lost in their sexual behavior, particularly with something like porn viewing. Seductive role sex. Seductive role sex really means a power play, that you are looking for someone, the sex addict is looking for someone to dominate, to push in the direction that they want to go sexually. We could look at this as a power dynamic, and many people look at sex addiction as not just the behavior, but a restoration of power. If someone does not feel strong, they will use sex as a way to have that strength. And obviously, we want to look at healthy sexuality as a search for connection and for intimacy. And in seductive role sex, there's a power dynamic that inherently denies that experience some intimacy. Excessive online cruising, again, as technology has evolved and the web has become a place for many things to find, the ability to look for sexual experiences through online media has become more and more accessible and more preferred. Excessive online cruising, again, if you look at this as you might look at pornography, excessive porn viewing, is this sort of the search or the ritual, which we'll talk about in a moment, the ritual of finding that person that you want to have sex with. And there are many sites that promote that allow that. We can look at sites that have hundreds or thousands of profiles, and the addict becomes goes into a bubble, we call it, where the ritual continues and continues and continues until they find what they believe they are looking for. Now, there's exhibitionist sex. In the old days, this is not about the man wearing the trench coat. These are sexual expressions that are in inappropriate places. This could be bathroom sex. That would be considered exhibitionist. Someone could walk in. This could be cam for cam, when you are showing your genitalia or having sex with someone through Skype or cam for cam. Again, this takes it out of the context of intimate sex, connected sex, and sex that is what I call generative, rather than reducing it to just a sexual experience. I have a question here saying, do you see these examples as exclusive, or do compulsives exhibit more than one? If you look at thank you for the question, Martin. Patrick Carnes, who is sort of the father of sex addiction research and treatment, used a study where he looked at 1,000 sex addicts, it says here, and looked at these behaviors through a statistical lens. It's often that an addict will exhibit multiple behaviors. One of these, and there are many other behaviors, based on access to the behavior, based on how the behavior impacts them. Again, excessive porn viewing is easy to access, it's easy to do. People who live in isolation or have a very difficult time connecting with someone sexually may use porn exclusively. But looking at the way that sex addicts act out, you would likely see multiple behaviors in the scope of sexual addiction. I have a question asking if that exhibitionist sex is always unhealthy. No, I don't think exhibitionist sex is always unhealthy. I think that exhibitionist sex, which is for the individual taking them out of either a safe emotional place or a physical place, can be unhealthy. So if one is exhibiting themselves for a sense of self-worth, for a sense of power, or for a way to receive approval beyond what I think would be seen as an intimate sexual experience, does it harm that individual? Does it put that individual in a place that puts them at risk in any way, shape, or form? And again, going back to the addiction model, what impact does this have on that individual's life? If someone engages in exhibitionist sex and they're happy with it and it's fine, absolutely. Healthy sex has many different forms. But if they're doing it in a way that could lead to arrest or loss of job or loss of family, then one has to ask, is that the healthiest kind of sex? So I hope that helps answer that question. So here we go again about this dialogue about, can sex really be an addiction? And we want to address this just again through the lens of how we see addiction in general and how we have seen our clients here at the center. So if one would sort of compare this to, let's say, alcoholism. an alcohol addiction. One of the key factors we look at with a client is the concept of tolerance and escalation. So at some point, the addict becomes numbed to the general behavior. The behavior becomes easier to tolerate, easier to experience. It doesn't require as much effort, so some of the excitement gets lost in it. So the escalation is, as with the drinker, am I drinking more? Am I drinking more often during the week? How many days am I drinking in general? Does it escalate from the sort of the basis point? So we look for sex addicts as, are they doing this once a week, then it became twice a week, then 8 times a week, of porn viewing, acting out. That helps us understand where the individual is in terms of the progress of addiction, just as you would with an alcoholic. How deep are they into their addiction? The other thing that we look at, particularly around sex, is the concept of stimulus, risk, and intensity. Again, when one is having any kind of addictive behavior, but particularly that is related to sex addiction, the question we have to ask is this person needing more? Is it not exciting enough to act out with anonymous sex, at someone's apartment? Is it more exciting to do it in public? Is it more exciting to do it with 2 or 3 people in a night? Is that what that individual, the addict, needs to have their sexual needs met and to comfort or soothe them? And we look at sex addiction often from the place of both an intimacy disorder, difficulty connecting, and also from an inability to self-soothe, to regulate one's own emotions, to take care of oneself, and to find healthier ways to tolerate discomfort, which all of us spend most of our life doing. How do I tolerate this bad feeling without trying to get rid of it? And again, we all use various methods to feel better. It could be sex, it could be alcohol, it could be eating or gambling. But when are we using it in place of healthy self-care? So I want to go over the sexual addiction cycle. Again, looking at this in terms of not just behavior, but a whole process that people go through. And I want to make it clear that as I talk about this, I'm not just talking about this in terms of gay men at this point. I think that heterosexual men and women and gay men and gay women who have addictive behaviors generally go through the same cycle with different behaviors. So what we look at, if you see the arrow facing down, we look at dependency needs, and it says stimulated by any strong feelings. What we see with people who have addictive behaviors is that the dependency needs, what we would call the needs for intimacy, for love, for compassion, for safety, and for connection, for whatever reason, and we often look back to childhood trauma, have not been met. So they don't have the internal resources to experience that, whether they have difficulty connecting with people or they have a sense of low self-esteem, a sense of less than, a sense of they're not worthy. So if those needs cannot be met, if someone can't in a healthy way embrace them and love them or help them through meeting these needs, they're going to have to look for a way to control their environment, control these needs. If they cannot be met, I'm going to find a way to meet them myself. So once the addict begins that cycle, again, we call it the bubble, the first step is the preoccupation and the fantasy. So this is, what do I want to do? People's sexual templates are different, again, based on some of the sexual behaviors I mentioned before. An individual could go into fantasy in many different ways. But the preoccupation is key because that says, I am obsessing about doing this. Not, I'd really like to go out and meet someone and have sex, but I must do this to feel better about myself. I want to continue to reinforce that. It's not about wanting, it's about needing to, or else I cannot tolerate my feelings. Then the individual goes into ritual. And this is literally the steps it takes, the process by which the individual prepares himself or herself. So we might look at a gay man who is going to look at pornography. One isn't just sitting in front of one's computer. It's broken down to many steps. An individual may have to make sure the roommate is gone, go to the computer, open the browser, search for the right kind of pornography, search and search and search until you find the right porn to view. For someone who is having anonymous sex, for instance, and is looking for that, part of it may be grooming themselves. I'm going to shower, I'm going to shave, trim, I'm going to put on really nice clothes, I'm going to drive to the bar, I'm going to look for a guy to pick up. So if we break it down into all these components, that's where we try to look at helping the addict break the behavior before the actual acting out. Where can the addict cut the ritual, slow down the ritual, say to themselves, I don't have to go through with it? So once the addict is in the addiction behavior, we call it the acting out. So this is literally the behavior, whether it's having anonymous sex, whether it's the masturbation, whether it's the exhibitionist sex, any of those things that is the template for the individual to act out. What happens after the acting out is obviously what we call the release. It's not just the sexual release, the orgasm, it's the release of the buildup of tension that individual has experienced. It is that moment of right? Literally, sometimes and figuratively. What the addict often does at that point is they go into what we call a numbing phase. And the numbing phase is a way for the individual to try to sort of continue to calm themselves down, to avert the shame-guilt element of the cycle for as long as possible. It's sort of the secondary self-soothe. For some people, this is numbing can be eating, it can be drinking, it can be sleeping, gambling, right? Watching television, playing video games, any way that the addict can slow down that descent into what we see next, which is shame, blame, and guilt. And the shame, blame, and guilt is important because it's a re-traumatizing of self. It's a re-shaming of self for the behavior. And we also look at blame because I think it's important that we consider that often in these experiences, the addict can blame someone or something else for their behavior. People, places, and things. If only my boyfriend hadn't yelled at me, or if only my boss hadn't been a jerk at my job. Any of those sort of things where it becomes about someone else rather than taking responsibility. But the shame is key to this cycle because what happens then is you go into that dark place again, which is where the behavior begins again, these dependency needs. Self-hatred, I am unworthy of love, no one will take care of me, I only can have my needs met through sex. So you see that it's a vicious cycle. And the cycle can happen very rapidly, or there can be a period where the individual abstains from sexual behavior as a way to control themselves or control their world. But for the addict, it doesn't hold very long. They need the sexual experience from fantasy to acting out and even to the shame, blame, and guilt for that sense of connection and sense of power. So again, sex addiction is not just about release, it's about power, it's about control of self, and it's about feeling better about who we are. So in looking at addiction from the standpoint of gay men and some of the issues that gay men, I believe, face, is this concept of internalized homophobia. How can that drive sex addiction among gay men? So internalized homophobia, as it says here, is the negative feelings that gay men have towards themselves because of who they are, because of the part of who they are. And internalized homophobia is taken in from society. It is taken in from messages that people receive, gay men receive from probably the earliest stages of their development. Now, these days we're fortunate because as gay marriage and gay rights and support for the LGBTQ community has sort of exploded in good ways in our society, particularly the United States, one can forget that there are many young gay men and women who experience the world as unsafe, the world as traumatizing, the world as hating them, whether it's family, friends, the media. So what happens is that the individuals who experience this take it in, and it becomes part of who they are. And what can this lead to? And how can this lead to addiction? Well, shame, we know from talking about it here, and I think hopefully everyone agrees, is the terrible motivator for behavior that is harmful. If I am a bad person, then if I do bad things, it reinforces it, and that's who I am. Gay men only like to have sex. Gay men can't be monogamous. Gay sex is disgusting, right? So all that gets dropped into the individual, and those messages are there. Do those messages sit with everybody? No. I would suggest that gay individuals are automatically traumatized when they come into this world because they are born into a world that is heterosexual, and people experience it from the heteronormative, this is the way people are supposed to be perspective. So what is denial? Denial is the I can't be gay, I don't want to be gay, but I really want to be gay. So people in denial will deny themselves in terms of they'll become married, they'll be in relationships with women, they will decide to be completely asexual, they will deny themselves and their sexuality. Well, at some point, when someone lives in that level of denial, they're not going to be able to tolerate it anymore. And this could lead to self-harm, whether it's suicide, whether it's alcoholism or drug addiction, or acting out sexually, because sex addiction is about harming oneself. It's about shaming oneself. It's about reinforcing negative messages. It's about putting oneself in what we call the one-down position. I am less than. So the only way I can sort of have my own strength and my own sense of power is to act out. And certainly, I think these first three bullets support the sexual acting out behavior. I think it's hard not to have these without sexually acting out. Again, that does not mean that everyone who experiences these will act out. Not every gay man is a sex addict. Not every straight man is a sex addict. Sex addicts are people whose sex life and sexual experience have harmed them and have harmed others significantly. So as I mentioned sort of earlier on in this, the ability to access sex, the ability to find sex is so easy. And so when that exists in our society, the sex addict really doesn't have very many barriers. And in the gay male community, there are a number of sites, there are a number of apps that people use to act out sexually. And these are problematic in many ways. We can start with sort of the quote-unquote old-fashioned, which are the websites, Craigslist, Adam for Adam, Rent Boy, BBRT, which is bareback, real time, for men who experience bareback sex. So these are all places one can go to immediately and look for sex. We have Grindr and Scruff, which are two of the GPS location systems. For those of you who don't know this, if you know Tinder, it's sort of like that. You can identify a gay man the number of feet away they are. You can know very quickly what they want. You can exchange pictures, and you can set up a sexual rendezvous in minutes, probably. Not understanding that those sexual rendezvous are filled with risk from a safety standpoint, from, I'd say, a dignity standpoint, and certainly from a self-care standpoint. Internet pornography, I've mentioned before, phenomenally easy to access, and one can look for all types of pornography. It is no longer, that narrow field of what gay porn looks like. And that can be, again, gay pornography can be very healthy and exciting and can enhance one's sexual experience. But as someone's interest, if it escalates in terms of the intensity of the type of porn someone is watching, if you go into porn that is violent in a non-consensual way, if you're looking at porn that involves, degradation and physical harm, and I'm not talking about BDSM, which are consensual behaviors, but if you need more stimulation to become aroused, then one has to ask the question, why do I need more? And again, the old-fashioned chat rooms, which do still exist, and this webcam and video chat. Again, this disconnected sexual experience where I can masturbate in front of you and you can masturbate in front of me, but we have no need to be close to each other. Also, the number of people that one can get involved with in a night. Right? For an addict, more is more and more is better. So conceivably someone could have 5 or 6 quote-unquote sexual encounters in an 8-hour period or a 5-hour period. So the landscape is so perfectly aligned for sex addiction, I think, in the whole community, both gay and straight, but for the gay community, where sex has always been in often ways a self-definition, a definition and a reclaiming of our strength, the use of these apps and sites can be ways that we can maximize our access to sex. And again, looking at why are we doing what we're doing, and are we doing this because we think that's all gay men do, or that's what other people think gay men do? Why am I in this behavior? So here's the part of the lecture that obviously hopefully many of you are interested in. I hope what we've done so far has given you some background and some context for this. So party drugs, that's a term that I think has probably been around for a couple of decades now because it's associated with parties, whether it's general dance clubs, gay dance clubs, raves, which, again, have been around for now a couple of decades, which are sort of your larger events and certainly has a very sort of different vibe to it, and circuit parties. And circuit parties are scheduled structures, events all around the country, the circuit, with different themes and sort of a similar experience, much of which, besides great music, is based on drug use. And we're going to talk about the kind of drugs that are often used in association with these parties, but also in association with sex. You'll probably have heard of most of these, but I want to go over again why their interaction can be so profound in supporting, promoting, or aligning a sex addiction. So what do party drugs do? As with any other chemicals, they're going to impact the neurotransmitters. They are going to affect certain receptors in the brain and change, for lack of a better term, the way they work. So when that happens, your brain chemistry is automatically changed, whether it's short-term or long-term. It changes the way you experience yourself, and it changes the way you experience the world around you. And in club dance settings, the stimuli is already fairly intense. Music, lights, physical proximity to other people, so you're already a little bit overwhelmed with what's going on. So once you start doing party drugs, that just enhances, increases. So one of the drugs that is often associated with gay events is MDMA. Used to be known as ecstasy, now is known as Molly. There are probably other names for it. So what Molly does is it really acts as a euphoric, right? It makes one feel excited, warm towards people, very connected, very engaged, really a very sort of a sensual drug. It also creates distortions. You're not exactly sure always what's going around you when it's happening, and it's very important from the sense of people engaging in anonymous sexual behaviors. Their inhibitions are decreased, but they're also dissociated. They're not in reality. They may not be making good choices, and it can also decrease inhibitions. So you're really in this sort of euphoric, dissociated, sometimes hallucinatory state, which makes making good decisions difficult. So while MDMA can be associated with sex addiction, it's not as much associated with sex addiction as it is with sex, maybe anonymous sex or casual sex, because of the way it affects the body. It's sort of a much slower experience. There's also GHB, which shifts a little bit more towards the stimulant element of brain reaction. So it excites the nervous system. It can make one feel much more sexual. It can also act as a dissociative, but still in a much more sort of agitating, up sort of way. So again, GHB may have some role in promoting sex addiction, but I would say from my own experience with clients that it's not as much as what crystal meth does. Marijuana, heroin, and Special K, which is ketamine, horse dog tranquilizer, those are really depressives, right? Those are dissociative, depressive, mood dropping drugs. So if one is in a sexual addiction or in an acting out phase, you want to be hyper aware, you want to be hyper connected, so you can maximize the experience you're having from a sexual standpoint. So I would say that these two, Molly and GHB, can be associated with sexual acting out, but not as much as what we're going to talk about next, which is crystal meth. So let's talk about crystal meth, as sort of what many people say, clinical folks, and I would say the gay community describes as sort of the drug of choice for sexual behavior, whether it's sexual acting out or in general looking for a sexual experience. Crystal meth is also known by some other names. One is ice. One is Tina, T, and it's glass, or also known as glass. It is basically a methamphetamine. It is speed times 100, and it is almost all of the substances in meth are not naturally occurring substances. It's chemicals, it's derivatives, it's things that one might find in your cleaning closet, in your household cleaning closet. The other thing about meth is the ways it can be used, the manner in which one might use it. It can be snorted, it can be smoked, it can be injected into the vein direct. It can also be inserted into the rectum or to the anus. Why that happens is it goes right into the blood tissue, right into the tissue, and the high hits immediately. So crystal meth extends the duration of a traditional high. With cocaine, the high can last 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how much you do with the first dose. With ecstasy, 6 to 10 hours possibly, same with GHB. But crystal meth users can be high up to 12 hours. And depending on the amount of crystal meth one uses, this could extend to what we call runs, 2, 3, 4 days of consistent, intense use. So meth is really a profoundly destructive drug. Research has shown that it immediately alters the brain chemistry, and that is why so many people have difficulty getting sober off of it. So meth decreases your inhibitions and increases dissociation. So the rational thought, is this a good idea, a bad idea, sort of goes out the window. And one is high immediately off of crystal meth. It does not take time to get there. And in terms of reducing the reducing the ability for rational thought, that's dissociation in itself. I'm leaving this real world. I'm going to go into my fantasy space about what the world looks like. Crystal meth, one of the most dangerous aspects of it for a sex addict is it fuels the libido. It pushes the libido sort of into overdrive. Many crystal meth addicts compulsively masturbate to porn. This may be part of their ritual to move to a sexual acting out partner. They do excessive online cruising, again, because the high is so long. One is looking for the excitement of the sexual ritual to last as long. So excessive online cruising, people can cruise for hours looking for a sexual partner. If they have a partner, they will go back online sometimes and look for another one. They may take another bump, as we call it, of crystal. So it just fuels the behavior. It's a really vicious cycle. And people on crystal meth can often have multiple anonymous sex partners because one can have sex sometimes for hours on crystal meth. And I know that sounds sort of hard to believe for those of you who've not worked with clients who deal with this issue. But hours indeed, which can cause damage, physical damage to both individuals. Often the individual is not able to have an orgasm because of how the drug affects the brain. So this seeking of release, which doesn't happen, can drive one to even more acting out behaviors. There's something that we talk about called addiction interaction, and some people call it fusing. This is when the addiction needs another addiction, when it becomes fused together in a way that one must exist with the other. So when we talk about meth, it can become very fused with sex. I have to be at a high to have sex. Now, that's not only because of the good feeling, but if a drug like meth is a dissociative, it can take someone out of their shame about sex, their anxiety about having sex, their concerns about their sexual performance. So using meth can decrease the inhibitions that not that they're unhealthy, but the inhibitions that keep gay men from feeling good about their sexuality. So rather than having worked through in the ways in which their sexuality and sexual behavior is healthy, they numb themselves out and use a drug like meth to live large, for lack of a better term, to have the kind of sex they want, whether it's traditional sex or alternative sexual experiences like bondage and discipline or sadomasochism. So I can't have sex if I don't use meth is the message. And the addiction interaction also plays out in the kind of partners an individual seeks. PNP means party and play. So many sex addicts, certainly people addicted to crystal meth who are sex addicts, are going to look for like-minded people. They're going to look for people who either have been using, will use, can provide them the drug, so they're able to meet on a sort of an even plane, so that there is no potential for intimacy, there is no potential for connection, there's only potential for sexual interaction with lack of shame, lack of self-awareness, and so it's just the physical experience. And again, what I said earlier in the lecture is we look at this as an intimacy disorder. An intimacy disorder meaning it's very difficult and very hard to connect to other individuals. And in this case, gay men connecting on both an emotional and a sexual on a sexual level. So the way the crystal meth addict and sex addict work is that connection is all based on genitalia. And that sounds probably very judgmental and sounds like a global statement, so I apologize for that, but I do believe it holds a lot of water in terms of sex addiction and treating both sex addiction and meth addiction. So we're sort of to that place where we talk about, okay, we have these double addictions going on. What do we do with this? First things first, in sex addiction treatment, we have to treat the drug addiction first. So we would not work with someone who is an active drug user, not because we think they're difficult or problematic, but because people cannot make rational decisions, really focus on self-care and self-healing if they are in active addiction. They are not capable of participating in their recovery. And we do talk about recovery in SAA or in sex addiction the way we talk about recovery in other 12 steps, which is what is the way in which my behaviors have brought me to this place, the powerlessness of it, and then what new behaviors can I engage in. So when we talk about this circle plan, for those of you who don't work with sex addicts, a circle plan is 3 concentric circles. There's an inner circle, a middle circle, and an outer circle. What sex addicts will place in their inner circle is their behaviors, the sexual behaviors that they have determined with their therapist and with their sponsor are no-goes. These are the behaviors that someone will not engage in to be sober. So that would be for a drug addict, crystal meth use, other drug use, could be anonymous sex, exhibitionist sex, sex with prostitutes, sexual affairs. Those are the ones that say, if I stay away from these things, I'm sexually sober. The challenge, obviously, is that one, as an alcoholic, one has one choice. I either drink or I don't drink. But with sex addiction and healthy sexuality, it's a much more complicated, nuanced exploration of what is healthy sex for an individual. So can healthy sex for a gay man be casual sex? Absolutely. Can healthy sexuality for a gay man be bondage and discipline? Absolutely. But what makes it healthy or what make it not healthy? Again, not to pathologize it, but if it comes from a place of shame, self-hatred, self-doubt, then one really has to say, is this really creating sexual intimacy? The middle circle would be the triggers. People, places, and things, and also feelings. So driving by a certain acting out spot, going to a certain dance club, talking to a certain acting out partner. These are the things that, can drag you down what we call the rabbit hole, right into your addiction. And then the outer circle are the healthy behaviors. what do I do as a gay man that is really healthy for me? I see friends. I, go to a gay-positive church. I'm involved in different meetup organizations where I get to know guys who like to play volleyball. Time with friends or family. All of those things we want to bring into the sex addicts universe so that they feel not just, I can't do this, but I have the opportunity to do all these other things. For many people, Outer Circle is a healthy dating relationship, and we often work with sex addicts on a dating plan. We call this place the Center for Healthy Sex, not the Center for No Sex. So there are 12-step programs we recommend, SAA, Sex Addicts Anonymous, Sexual Compulsives Anonymous, and SLAW, which is Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous. Absolutely essential for individual and group therapy, looking at toxic shame, which we talked about before, and healthy coping mechanisms. How can I deal with my difficult experiences by not by acting out? So what is healthy sexuality? It's, as I said at the beginning, let's abstain, but that's not enough. How do I build greater intimacy, better relationships, both with friends and a romantic relationship? How do I define what is healthy sexuality for me? And then, what are my coping mechanisms? If anger and fear and loneliness are triggers for me to act out, well, then how do I know how to treat myself with compassion and self-love to address these? And in doing that, and in building healthier relationships, you have greater self-esteem and greater self-acceptance. So that was really a quick run-through. We're really looking at this, really the drug interaction and for gay men, but there's certainly a host of other issues to talk about. Unfortunately, we don't have the time. So in terms of questions, I haven't seen many come in via email. I'm going to unmute my phone and see if there are any questions. But you can also email me at dan@centerforhealthysex.com. And at CHS, for those of you who are local, we do run a sex addicts group. It's both for straight and for gay men, which we find.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
All right, you can all unmute yourself by pressing *6 to talk. So we run a sex addicts group. We run an intensive outpatient program, an 11-day intensive program. And that is really intensive for someone to come in who's really struggling, and they spend the 11 days working with our clinicians intensely. I have a question. How much does the gay community in and of itself encourage addiction? Wow, that's a loaded, complicated question. I don't know that any community encourages addiction. I would sort of actually ask if society in general encourages addiction, the way it promotes sex and drugs and rock and roll and alcohol and cigarettes. So I think it's not the gay community. I think addiction may be more prevalent in the gay community because of the more trauma that many gay men have experienced. And so they may look to comforts outside of the normal comfort they probably didn't get or may not have gotten in their youth. So if I can't feel good about myself, maybe I will turn to alcohol, maybe I will turn to drugs, maybe I will turn to sex addiction. And those are the exact same things that straight men we work with say, right? So I think that's a great question. I think it's probably a question for a whole other dialogue about us, the gay community, encouraging addiction. Thank you. Any other questions, thoughts? I'm also welcome disagreement in the last 3 minutes we have, because this is a very complicated issue. Again, particularly in the gay community, where gay men, I believe, I certainly can say it, have felt pathologized because of their sexuality, and that's really important. I have a question. How does one help a sex addict friend or family member? How does one, validate that individual's experience, that this person is suffering, that sex addiction. If that person thinks they're struggling with sex addiction, they probably are, because an alcoholic who's not an alcoholic doesn't usually say, I'm an alcoholic. So first thing is compassion. Second is finding the resources, which could be 12-step meetings, and there are online resources all over the place. And I think it's also really important that you look for effective treatment. There are therapists known as CSATs, C-S-A-T, which is a certified sex addiction treatment therapist, who are really wonderful. They can certainly come to CHS or any of the other sex addiction treatment centers across the country. I have a quick question. Can you say a bit more about how you see being gay as an experience of trauma in and of itself, the general experience of being gay without necessarily being connected to a specific incident or overt violence? Great question, because we can look at trauma in terms of capital T and lowercase t. Capital T, sexual, psychological, physical, neglect. I would posit that lowercase trauma is growing up in a family where you may have to hide who you are for fear of being outed, for fear of being rejected, hiding who you are in school because of the same things, hiding who you are because you can't tolerate the thought that you're gay. Those are traumatic experiences. So I think that's really where we need to look at trauma being described in the gay community. And what would you recommend regarding drug, sex-linked relapse? That's a big question as well. We always talk about treating the addiction first, but I'd encourage you who've asked this question to email me about that, given the time that we have, and I'd be happy to speak with you more about it. Can you discuss any couples therapy models that focus in this area? Yes. What we generally try to do is we try to treat the sex addict and the partner in two different ways. We have the sex addict go through his own recovery track, and there is a recovery track for a partner, which is critical. I think people get lost in this, partners. And also then we work with them as a couple. And again, there's a lot more information in that, and I would be very happy to talk to you about that offline. I think that's been really lost in the shuffle. We do a lot of great treatment with sex addicts, and partners get short shrift. I think those are the questions I have and the time we have. I hope you all got something out of this. I would welcome you emailing questions, thoughts, concerns, continuing the dialogue. This is a complicated issue, I think a very interesting issue, and I think all of us who are in the profession or our clients or potential clients can do a lot to bring awareness to it and to do a lot of healing for ourselves and for others. So I thank you very much. I wish you a happy Friday and a happy weekend, and do be in touch. Thank you.